The morning of November 16th, 2025, began like any other in Santa Rosa County, Florida. But for the family of 14-year-old Danika Troy, it would quickly become a day of unbearable sorrow. Danika had gone out the previous evening, planning to meet some friends and ride her electric scooter around the neighborhood, but she never made it home. Her mother, anxious and growing more concerned with each passing hour, reported her missing to the authorities. For the next 24 hours, the small community of Pace was thrown into a state of panic as the search for Danika intensified. Her family, friends, and local law enforcement combed through every corner of the town, trying to piece together where she might be. The hours dragged on without any word from Danika, and the uncertainty only deepened. Then, on the morning of November 17th, a passerby walking along a wooded trail near Kimberly Road made a horrifying discovery. Hidden amidst the trees, away from the main roads, lay the lifeless body of a young girl, burnt beyond recognition. The scene was chilling. Her body had been shot multiple times, and the flames that had consumed her had left only the charred remains behind. The passerby, understandably shaken, immediately called 911. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived on the scene to confirm that the girl found in the woods was none other than Danika Troy. She was no longer the vibrant teen with a future ahead of her. She was now the victim of an unimaginable crime. Her family, already in agony from the thought of her being missing, were now forced to confront the brutal truth. Danika was dead, and her life had been stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. The authorities immediately secured the area, and investigators began their work, piecing together the puzzle of what had happened to this young girl. The first signs were clear. The nature of her death was violent, and the method of disposal so callous that it left everyone who came across the scene in shock. Danika had not only been shot multiple times, but had also been set on fire, leaving no doubt that this was no accident. With the discovery of her body, the search for Danika's killer began in earnest. The tight-knit community of Pace, Florida, was left reeling. Who could commit such a savage act against a young girl? How had she ended up in the woods, discarded like trash? The tragedy was just beginning to unfold. The search for justice was now paramount, but no one could have predicted how far-reaching this case would become. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the investigation and the shocking twists that would follow in this case. Danika Troy was a 14-year-old girl full of life, energy, and promise. Known for her bright smile and infectious laugh, she was the kind of person who could light up any room she entered. She had dreams and aspirations like any other young teenager, hopes for the future, friends to laugh with, and a family who adored her. Danika was a student at the local high school, where she was known for being friendly, outgoing, and kind-hearted. She had an infectious personality that made her well-liked among her peers. Her love for adventure and the outdoors was evident in the way she spent her free time, often riding her electric scooter around the neighborhood, exploring the nearby trails, and meeting up with friends. For her mother and family, Danika was more than just a daughter. She was their joy, the bright spot in their lives, and someone who brought so much happiness to everyone around her. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents had always hoped for a future where their daughter would flourish. An educated, kind, and successful woman with a world of opportunities ahead of her. But on the night of November 16th, 2025, something went terribly wrong. That evening, Danika left her home to ride her scooter, planning to meet some friends in the neighborhood. She'd done this many times before, always coming back home by the time the night settled in. But this time, something was different. Danika didn't come back. Her mother, initially hopeful that her daughter was just spending time with friends, soon began to worry. As the night wore on and Danika's absence stretched into hours, the growing sense of unease began to take over. By morning, her mother reported her missing to the authorities, and a search began. Danika's friends, family, and concerned community members joined the effort, scouring the area for any sign of her. The search went on through the day and into the night, but no one knew where she was. The only clue left behind was her electric scooter, found abandoned near a nearby wooded trail, but there were no signs of her anywhere nearby. For her family, The search was harrowing. Every moment that passed without any sign of her felt like a lifetime. They clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she was lost or hurt somewhere and would come home soon. But deep down, they feared the worst. And just when they thought they couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer, the unthinkable happened. The discovery of Danika's body in the woods would change everything. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a murder investigation. The brutal truth had settled in. Danika Troy, the bright, vibrant teen with so much potential, would never come home. The discovery shattered her family, her friends, and the entire community. Danika's life, full of so much hope and promise, had been stolen away in the most brutal way imaginable. The questions of why and who began to echo through the minds of everyone who knew her, but answers were still elusive. Danika's story was just beginning to unravel. In the coming days, the investigation would reveal dark secrets, hidden motives, and a twisted tale of betrayal that no one could have foreseen. The early hours of November 17th, 2025, would forever be etched in the minds of those who lived in the quiet town of Pace, Florida. As the sun began to rise, a passerby, an ordinary person walking through the woods near Kimberly Road, came upon something that would forever change the course of the investigation and the lives of Danika Troy's family. The wooded area was typically quiet, a place where locals might stroll or bike on a peaceful afternoon. But that morning, a gruesome scene awaited. Hidden among the trees, away from the main trail, lay the lifeless body of a young girl. She was unrecognizable, burned almost beyond belief. Her body had been set on fire, leaving the charred remains of what was once a vibrant teen. The passerby, clearly shaken by the sight, wasted no time in calling the authorities. The police arrived quickly, securing the area and beginning the painful task of identifying the remains. It didn't take long for them to notice the telltale signs, the electric scooter nearby. It was an object Danika was known to ride frequently, and it immediately became clear that this wasn't just any ordinary scene. The scooter was a vital clue. No one could mistake that it belonged to Danika, whose love for the ride had been well known by her family and friends. As investigators moved closer to the body, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They found personal belongings, Danika's phone, and some pieces of clothing scattered near the scene, confirming their worst fears. The remains were, in fact, those of the missing 14-year-old girl. The initial shock of discovering a body in the woods paled in comparison to the horror of realizing that this was Danika. The realization that her family's worst nightmare had just come true was felt in the air, heavy with grief and disbelief. For Danika's mother, the moment of identification was heart-wrenching. In that moment, the hope of finding her daughter safe and sound vanished forever. The search that had begun with a sliver of optimism had now come to a gut-wrenching conclusion. Her daughter was gone, violently taken from her. The thought of a young girl's life being stolen so brutally left her family shattered. The scene itself was chilling. The scorched remains of Danika's body were a stark contrast to the young girl she once was. The girl who loved adventure, who laughed with her friends, who dreamt of a future full of possibilities. Now, she was reduced to a tragic figure, her life extinguished in an act of pure violence. The flames that had engulfed her body had not only destroyed her physical form, but had also robbed her of the chance to live the life she was meant to lead. As the authorities began their investigation, they knew they were dealing with a case far darker than anyone could have predicted. This was not a random accident. This was a premeditated act, a senseless, cold-blooded murder. The nature of the crime spoke volumes. Not only had Danika been shot multiple times, but she had also been set on fire, a chilling act that left no doubt about the intent behind it. In those first painful hours after the discovery, the community's shock gave way to a single question. Who could have done this to a 14-year-old girl? And why? As the investigation deepened, those questions would soon find disturbing answers. But for now, the focus was on bringing justice for Danika, and for her grieving family who would never get to hold their daughter again. As the investigation into Danika Troy's tragic death unfolded, law enforcement worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to her brutal murder. Early on, the police focused on the idea that this wasn't a random crime. It was targeted, deliberate, and carefully planned. With little evidence to go on in the hours following the discovery of Danika's body, investigators began to gather information from the people closest to her. Through interviews with friends and family, authorities learned that Danika had been in contact with two boys in the days leading up to her disappearance: 16-year-old Gabriel Williams and 14-year-old Kimahri Blevins. Both teens were students at Pace High School, just like Danika, and had crossed paths with her on several occasions. In fact, it became clear that all three were at one point acquainted, and this connection would soon play a crucial role in piecing together the mystery of her death. The first break in the case came when detectives uncovered some unsettling details about the relationship between the victim and her alleged killers. It was revealed that there had been tension between Danika and the two boys, particularly Gabriel Williams, with social media exchanges providing a glimpse into a growing conflict. The online arguments, though seemingly harmless at first, escalated into something far more serious. Witnesses began to speak out, and details about the final moments of Danika's life started to surface. One witness provided a chilling account of a conversation overheard between the suspects, suggesting that Danika's murder was a premeditated act. Gabriel Williams, who had been notably upset by something Danika had allegedly posted online, had expressed his anger and frustration to others. It became clear that he had harbored a deep resentment toward her, and this anger, according to investigators, had boiled over into something far more sinister. Kimahri Blevins, the 14-year-old, was also implicated in the crime. While his role in the murder was still being pieced together, authorities were certain that he had been with Gabriel on the night of Danika's death. Surveillance footage and phone records confirmed that both teens were in the area where Danika had been last seen, and the evidence soon pointed to them as the primary suspects in the case. The tipping point came when Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins were brought in for questioning. After hours of intense interrogation, both boys eventually confessed to their involvement in Danika's murder. The details of their confession were chilling. According to their statements, they had lured Danika into the woods under the pretense of meeting up, only for Gabriel to open fire on her. Once she had been shot, the two boys allegedly set her body on fire, leaving her to burn in the woods. The confession was a gut-wrenching revelation for Danika's family, who now had to face the horrific truth that the killers of their beloved daughter were not strangers, but two young boys who had once shared space with her in the same school. The motive, driven by anger and online conflict, seemed almost incomprehensible. How could two teenagers, still so young themselves, be capable of committing such a heinous act against a peer? With their confessions in hand, the police quickly arrested Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins. Both teens were charged with first-degree premeditated murder, a crime that carries severe penalties in Florida. Gabriel, at 16 years old, was considered an adult in the eyes of the law, while Kimahri, just 14, would also face adult charges due to the nature of the crime. The news of their arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The idea that two teenagers could commit such an act was unfathomable to many, but also raised troubling questions about the state of youth violence, social media, and the pressures facing today's young people. The families of both boys were left grappling with the reality of what their children had done, while Danika's family was left in the wake of a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. With the arrests made and the suspects in custody, the question on everyone's mind was how the justice system would handle this case. Would the teens be tried as adults? And if so, what would be the consequences of their actions? The legal battle was just beginning, but for now, the arrest marked the first step toward justice for Danika Troy. The tragic events that led to the death of 14-year-old Danika Troy were as chilling as they were horrifying. According to the confessions of Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins, the crime was not a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was, instead, a premeditated plan, carefully conceived and executed with cold calculation. On the evening of November 16th, Danika had gone out, as she often did, to ride her electric scooter around the neighborhood. The plans she had for the evening were nothing out of the ordinary. a typical outing for a young girl who loved the outdoors and enjoyed spending time with friends. But unknown to her, a dangerous plan was unfolding in the minds of Gabriel and Kimahri. Both boys had been in touch with Danika in the days leading up to her disappearance, and their interactions had not been friendly. Gabriel Williams, 16, had been particularly upset with something Danika had posted on social media. The argument, which seemed trivial at first, had escalated to a level of resentment that would ultimately lead to violence. Gabriel felt deeply insulted, and this resentment festered in the days leading up to the murder. Kimahri Blevins, who was 14, was allegedly complicit in the plan, though his exact role remained murky in the initial stages of the investigation. But one thing was clear: the two teens had orchestrated the tragic event together. The plan was set in motion when the two teens contacted Danika, inviting her to meet them at a secluded area just outside of town. Danika, unaware of the danger that awaited her, agreed to meet them, trusting the boys she had known from school. Gabriel and Kimahri allegedly lured her into the woods near Kimberly Road, a quiet, isolated stretch of land that would become the site of her brutal murder. Once they were in the woods, away from any prying eyes, the nightmare began. Gabriel Williams, driven by his anger and resentment, confronted Danika. It wasn't long before the confrontation turned violent. According to their statements, Gabriel shot Danika multiple times at close range, leaving her no chance to escape. The young girl, caught off guard and terrified, was powerless against the sudden onslaught. The sheer violence of the attack was shocking. She had been shot multiple times, the fatal blows striking her in quick succession. What happened next was even more chilling. Once Gabriel and Kimahri had ensured that Danika was dead, they set her body on fire. They doused her with some sort of accelerant and lit the flames, leaving her to burn in the woods. The fire not only destroyed the evidence of her life, but it also added a level of cruelty to an already brutal act. It was as if her life had been reduced to nothing more than ashes, her body a mere husk after the flames had done their work. The decision to set her on fire was not impulsive, it was part of the plan. The two teens knew what they were doing. Gabriel Williams reportedly told authorities that he wanted to make sure there would be no way for Danika to be identified quickly, making it harder for the police to piece together what had happened. The callousness with which they disposed of her body showed a complete disregard for her life, her dignity, and the loved ones she left behind. What is perhaps most disturbing about this entire crime is how calculated it was. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. Gabriel and Kimahri had planned it. The conflict, initially sparked by social media disagreement, had festered into something much darker. Their decision to lure Danika into the woods, to shoot her, and then to burn her body. These were all actions taken with the full knowledge of what they were doing. The aftermath of their crime was a twisted combination of arrogance and indifference. They believed they had gotten away with it. Gabriel, at least initially, seemed to think that burning Danika's body would be enough to erase any trace of their involvement. But it was the sheer brutality of their actions, the cold and deliberate nature of the crime, that ultimately led to their downfall. As the investigation unfolded, the shocking details of the murder began to emerge. The cold-bloodedness with which the two teens had killed Danika and then discarded her like trash left everyone in disbelief. How could two young boys, who had grown up in the same small town as Danika, be capable of such violence? The details were gut-wrenching for Danika's family. The idea that their daughter, their sister, could be murdered by peers she knew and trusted was almost too much to bear. The brutality of the crime seemed unfathomable, and yet, as the investigation continued, it became clear that this was not a random act of violence. It was a crime driven by anger, resentment, and a complete lack of empathy. As Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins were eventually arrested and charged with first-degree murder, it became painfully clear that the death of Danika Troy was not just the result of a tragic accident. It was the consequence of deliberate choices made by two young people who had allowed their anger to spiral into something far more monstrous. In the aftermath of the brutal murder of 14-year-old Danika Troy, one question lingered in the minds of investigators, her family, and the community. Why? What could possibly drive two young teenagers, peers of Danika, who had shared school halls and friendships, to commit such a heinous crime? While the details of the crime itself were horrifying, the motive behind it seemed almost impossible to grasp at first. But as investigators dug deeper, a painful truth began to emerge. Danika's murder was driven by something far more trivial on the surface, but devastating in its consequences: a conflict born from social media. The genesis of the tragedy appeared to lie in a falling out between Danika and Gabriel Williams, one of her killers. At its core, this was a story of adolescent rivalry. Online insults exchanged, hurt feelings, and egos bruised. What started as a typical teenage disagreement in the digital world snowballed into an irreversible act of violence. According to Gabriel Williams, the motive for his anger and eventual violence came from a specific exchange between him and Danika on social media. Williams reportedly claimed that Danika had insulted him publicly, and the words hit him harder than anyone could have anticipated. He was deeply hurt by what Danika said. While the exact nature of the comments remains unclear, what became evident was that the impact of those online interactions was enough to fuel a simmering resentment in Gabriel. As the weeks passed, Gabriel's anger toward Danika grew. According to reports, he began to fixate on the insult and felt that Danika had publicly humiliated him. For many teenagers, social media can become an arena where reputation and self-esteem are constantly on display, and perceived slights, whether intentional or not, can feel catastrophic. For Gabriel, the exchange on social media wasn't something he could let go of. Instead of confronting Danika directly or letting the matter fade, his anger brewed, and he began to plan his revenge. Kimahri Blevins, the 14-year-old co-conspirator in the murder, was allegedly involved in the planning. While it appears that he may not have been as emotionally invested in the conflict, he was drawn into the situation by his association with Gabriel and, perhaps, by the desire to impress or align himself with a peer. In some cases, peer pressure and a desire to fit in can lead young people down dangerous paths, and this appears to have played a role in Kimahri's involvement in the crime. Gabriel's actions, fueled by perceived humiliation and anger, eventually led to a cold, premeditated decision. Rather than resolve the conflict in a healthy, responsible way, he chose to escalate it in the most extreme and irreversible manner. The plan to lure Danika into the woods and end her life was calculated. It was not a rash decision made in the heat of the moment, but the culmination of a simmering vendetta that had been nurtured over time. Gabriel reportedly admitted that the emotional hurt he felt from Danika's online remarks had consumed him, eventually clouding his judgment and leading him to justify the violent act. What makes this case so tragic, and in many ways so terrifying, is how a simple online interaction spiraled into a loss of life. In today's world, where social media can sometimes feel like the ultimate battleground for status and validation, it is easy for young people to feel as though their reputation is on the line with every post, comment, and like. For Gabriel, what may have seemed like a small insult, a comment made in passing, became the trigger for something far darker. While social media may have been the spark, the fire of violence was stoked by a combination of immaturity, a lack of emotional regulation, and an inability to cope with feelings of anger and betrayal. It's clear that neither Gabriel nor Kimahri had the tools or emotional maturity to handle their emotions in a healthy way. Instead of confronting Danika in person, talking things out, or simply walking away from the situation, they chose to take matters into their own hands in the most violent way possible. The fact that two young teenagers could escalate something as minor as an online dispute into a premeditated murder is a sobering reflection of the pressures many teens face today. The widespread use of social media platforms, while providing opportunities for connection, also opens the door to bullying, emotional manipulation, and conflict that can spiral out of control. In some cases, as in Danika's, these online exchanges can become fatal. For Danika's family, the discovery that her life was taken due to something as senseless as a hurtful comment on social media was devastating. They were left not only grieving the loss of their daughter, but also struggling to understand how such a tragedy could have been born from something that, to most people, would seem so trivial. The death of their daughter became a grim reminder of the power of words and the impact that unchecked emotions, amplified by social media, can have on young minds. When news of Danika Troy's murder spread through the quiet town of Pace, Florida, the shockwaves reverberated through every corner of the community. Pace, a small, tight-knit town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, had always been a place of comfort and security. It was a place where neighbors greeted one another with a friendly wave, where children played in the streets, and families gathered for weekend barbecues. The town had never seen anything like this before, a brutal, premeditated murder carried out by two teenagers, both of whom had grown up in the very same town. For many in Pace, the thought that such a violent crime could happen here seemed impossible. How could two young boys, both of whom had attended the local high school, be capable of such brutality? The murder of Danika was unfathomable, not just because of the violence itself, but because of the young age of the perpetrators. In a place where people felt safe and crimes of this nature were practically unheard of, the idea that two teenagers were capable of such a heinous act sent shockwaves through the community's very foundation. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins were left in disbelief. They struggled to comprehend how the boys, whom many had known for years, could commit such a horrific act. To those who had seen Gabriel and Kimahri around town, it seemed almost impossible to reconcile their image as normal teenagers with the savagery of the crime they had committed. In a community where families looked out for one another, the idea that two local boys could plan and carry out such a violent act was simply beyond understanding. The local sheriff's office was equally taken aback by the sheer brutality of the crime. Sheriff's deputies, who had worked in the area for years, were no strangers to investigating criminal cases, but this was different. The violent nature of Danika's death, coupled with the young age of the suspects, left law enforcement officers struggling to make sense of the situation. How could two teenagers, seemingly like any other, be driven to murder? And why such a brutal, premeditated act? These were the questions that lingered in the minds of everyone involved in the investigation. Sheriff's officials expressed their shock at the case, acknowledging that they had never encountered anything quite like it in their careers. The thought that the killers were local boys, both with families and lives in the same small town, made the case even more disturbing. The brutality of the murder was hard to reconcile with the idea of a close-knit, family-oriented town like Pace. It was as though the very fabric of the community had been torn apart. For Danika's family, the shock of losing their daughter in such a violent and senseless way was compounded by the fact that the killers were people they had known, and people who were just as young as Danika. The grief they experienced was not just the loss of their beloved daughter, but the trauma of knowing that two teenagers, kids she had likely seen in school hallways, were the ones responsible for her death. This added an additional layer of complexity to their mourning. It wasn't just about coping with the loss of a child. It was also about trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. The community struggled to process the reality of the situation. There was no easy explanation for why this had happened, and no simple way to understand how things had gone so terribly wrong. In a town like Pace, where crimes like this were virtually unheard of, people turned to one another for support. Neighbors offered their condolences to Danika's family, and local organizations came together to offer grief counseling for those affected by the tragedy. But no one was immune to the pain and confusion that followed. How had something so senseless, so violent, occurred in their town? For many in the community, the crime seemed like a wake-up call, a reminder that violence, especially youth violence, could strike anywhere, even in the most peaceful of places. The impact of the murder rippled outward, affecting not just Danika's family, but the entire town. In the weeks and months that followed, the community would be forced to confront the reality of youth violence and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and unresolved conflict. As the investigation into Danika's murder continued and the arrests of Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins were made, the community of Pace was left to pick up the pieces. The town would never be the same, and the families involved would forever carry the weight of this horrific tragedy. The questions, why did this happen? How could two teenagers do such a thing? Remained unanswered for many, but the heartache and loss were something that no one could escape. Danika's murder had shattered the illusion of safety that once defined Pace. In a town where people once felt protected, now there was an undercurrent of fear, a realization that even the most innocent-seeming places could harbor darkness. The tragedy served as a painful reminder that, in the modern age, social media, emotions, and unresolved issues could escalate into something far more destructive than anyone could anticipate. As the investigation into the brutal murder of 14-year-old Danika Troy unfolded, the legal proceedings quickly became a focal point for the community, the victim's family, and the entire justice system. The crime was undeniably horrific, and as the details of the premeditated murder were revealed, it became clear that the two teens responsible, 16-year-old Gabriel Williams and 14-year-old Kimahri Blevins, would face serious legal consequences. The severity of their actions was too great for any leniency, and the decision was made to try them as adults. Gabriel, who was 16 at the time of the crime, was legally considered an adult under Florida law. For Kimahri, the decision was a more complicated one. Despite being just 14, his involvement in the murder was just as significant and premeditated as Gabriel's, and prosecutors made it clear that they would be seeking adult charges against him as well. The emotional and psychological maturity of both teens played a central role in this decision. Though they were both technically minors, their actions were far beyond the typical behavior expected from someone their age. The charges against both boys were heavy. First-degree premeditated murder, which carried the potential for life sentences without the possibility of parole. The nature of the crime, brutal, deliberate, and calculated, meant that the prosecutors would seek the maximum penalties allowed under the law. The legal team would aim to show that these were not crimes of passion or in-the-moment violence. Instead, they were premeditated acts driven by anger, resentment, and malice. The consequences of being tried as adults for a crime of this magnitude were severe. If convicted, Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins faced decades, or potentially even life, in prison. In Florida, the sentencing for first-degree murder is harsh. The state has a well-known stance on violent crimes, particularly when they involve minors who have committed such acts of extreme violence. In cases where minors are convicted of first-degree murder, they can be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would effectively strip them of any future freedom. The legal system would also examine their ability to be rehabilitated, but given the calculated nature of the crime, rehabilitation seemed an unlikely outcome for many who followed the case. Danika's family, already reeling from the loss of their daughter, was thrust into the legal battle as well. They would need to contend not only with the emotional weight of their grief, but also with the difficulty of the legal process. Every court date, every piece of evidence presented was a painful reminder of the violence that had taken their child away from them. They wanted justice, nothing less than the maximum sentence for the teens who had destroyed their family's world. The prosecution, led by a dedicated team, worked diligently to build their case. Their strategy was to show the premeditated nature of the crime. Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins had not acted impulsively. They had planned the murder, lured Danika into the woods, and executed the killing with chilling precision. Afterward, they went to the lengths of setting her body on fire, making sure there would be no chance of her surviving. Their actions left no room for doubt that this was a planned, cold-blooded act. On the defense side, the attorneys for both Gabriel and Kimahri would have to mount a challenge to the charges, arguing for reduced sentences or arguing for rehabilitation instead of punishment, particularly in the case of the younger teen, Kimahri. It was anticipated that they would seek to emphasize their clients' ages, backgrounds, and potential for rehabilitation. They might argue that, due to their youth, they could be rehabilitated through the juvenile justice system, rather than being sentenced to the harsh realities of adult prison life. However, this defense seemed weak in light of the brutal, premeditated nature of the crime. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the case garnered significant attention from the public and the media. Many were outraged that two young people, kids who were supposed to be in school, living the lives of teenagers, had been capable of such violence. The trial would not only have consequences for the two teens involved, but also for how the justice system handled youth violence in the digital age, where social media disputes could escalate into life-altering consequences. For the community of Pace, the legal process was a necessary step in seeking justice for Danika. The case had shaken the town to its core, and the outcome of the trial would undoubtedly have a profound impact on how people viewed not only the individuals involved, but also the wider issues of youth violence, anger, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. As the trial began, the eyes of the community and the nation were fixed on the courtroom. Would justice be served for Danika Troy? And what would the future hold for Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins as they faced the consequences of their actions? The aftermath of Danika Troy's brutal murder was a devastating and complicated journey for her family, friends, and the entire community. Danika's death left an indelible mark on everyone who knew her, particularly her family, who were forced to navigate a world without their beloved daughter and sister. The grief was overwhelming, a deep and unrelenting sorrow that seeped into every corner of their lives. For Danika's parents, the loss was incomprehensible. They had raised their daughter to be kind, compassionate, and full of promise. She was their baby girl, their source of joy, and the future they had imagined together. To have that future ripped away by the violence of two young boys they had never suspected would be capable of such brutality was a cruel blow. The pain of losing a child is indescribable. But to lose a child in such a violent and senseless manner adds a layer of anguish that words cannot capture. Every moment without Danika felt like a hollow echo of the life they once shared, a constant reminder of a young girl whose potential was stolen far too soon. Danika's siblings, too, were left grappling with the harsh reality of her absence. They lost not just a sister, but a friend, a confidant, someone they could turn to for comfort and companionship. The bond between siblings is a powerful one, and for Danika's brothers and sisters, the pain of knowing they would never see her again was an unthinkable tragedy. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, a task that felt insurmountable in the face of such raw grief. For her friends, the loss was equally profound. Danika had been known for her warmth and lightheartedness. She was the friend who could always be counted on to brighten the room, who knew how to make others laugh and feel accepted. Her friends had trusted her, shared their secrets with her, and experienced the highs and lows of adolescence together. Now, they were left with nothing but the memory of the girl they once knew and the unbearable reality that she was gone. Their grief was compounded by the fact that the crime had been committed by two boys who, in a small town like Pace, were people they had seen in the halls of their own school. It was an unfathomable breach of trust, a betrayal that no one could have anticipated. The pain of Danika's loss rippled through the entire community. Pace, a town where families had long felt safe, suddenly became a place marked by trauma and uncertainty. Neighbors who had once exchanged smiles and pleasantries now struggled to understand how something so brutal could happen in their midst. The very fabric of the community seemed torn apart by the knowledge that two local teenagers, two boys from their own town, had committed such a horrific act. It wasn't just the loss of Danika that affected everyone. It was a reminder that even in the most familiar, safe environments, violence could erupt in the most unexpected of ways. As the trial of Gabriel Williams and Kimahri Blevins began, the community was forced to confront the harsh reality of youth violence. The motivations behind the crime were rooted in something so seemingly small, a social media dispute, that it left many wondering how we, as a society, have reached a point where children are resorting to such extreme measures to settle conflicts. The case raised unsettling questions about the emotional and mental well-being of young people, the dangers of online bullying and social media conflicts, and the deeper issues surrounding anger, resentment, and the inability to resolve disputes peacefully. For Danika's family, the journey through grief was only beginning. They would have to endure not only the pain of her loss, but also the legal proceedings that followed. The constant reminders of the violence that had taken their daughter. Every court appearance, every news report, was a painful reminder of the brutality that had forever altered their lives. And yet, even as they faced the most unimaginable of tragedies, they held on to the memory of Danika, the bright, beautiful young girl who had once filled their home with laughter and love. In the wake of the crime, some found solace in the outpouring of support from the community. Grief counseling services were made available to help those affected by the tragedy, and local organizations came together to provide comfort to those who needed it most. But no amount of support could erase the pain of losing a child, a sister, or a friend. As time passed, the community of Pace struggled to find a sense of normalcy. People came together to honor Danika's memory, holding vigils and memorials in her name, trying to find a way to keep her spirit alive despite the cruelty of her death. But even as they sought to heal, the questions about youth violence and the growing sense of anger among young people remained unanswered. Danika's murder had highlighted a disturbing trend, one that would require more than just prayers and sympathy to fix. It would require a shift in how society approached youth conflict, mental health, and the pressures that young people face in an increasingly digital and disconnected world. For Danika's family, the grief was a heavy burden they would carry forever. The absence of their daughter left a hole in their hearts that could never be filled. Yet, in the midst of the pain, they found strength in the memory of the young girl she had been. A girl whose life was taken too soon, but whose spirit would live on in the hearts of those who loved her. The tragic murder of 14-year-old Danika Troy serves as a sobering reminder of how senseless acts of violence can utterly devastate not only the lives of the victims, but the entire fabric of a community. In a world that increasingly relies on digital interactions, the lines between online disputes and real-life consequences are becoming dangerously blurred. What started as a seemingly trivial social media argument between Danika and Gabriel Williams spiraled into a catastrophic event, one that has forever altered the lives of those involved and left a town reeling in disbelief. Danika's family will never be the same. The loss of a young girl with so much potential, so much life left to live, is an incomprehensible blow. Her friends are left haunted by the void she left behind, a presence they can never replace. The two young perpetrators, Gabriel and Kimahri, will also face the consequences of their actions, but the ripple effect of their crime will echo through their lives forever. Two young men who should have been focused on their education, their dreams, and their futures instead became part of a story that will forever mark them as the killers of a young girl. This crime, in its most basic form, was a tragedy born from anger, miscommunication, and a lack of emotional regulation, fueled by a series of online insults and the inability to reconcile their differences in a peaceful, productive way. But the more profound issue here is the question of why such violence could occur in the first place. What drove two teenagers to such a drastic and extreme response to something as common as an online argument? Was it the escalating pressure to win social media battles? Was it the inability to deal with personal emotions in a healthy way? Or was it the result of a deeper, more complex issue, a lack of guidance, support, and understanding in the face of growing aggression and violence among youth? As we reflect on Danika's life and the tragedy of her death, it's important to consider what could have been done to prevent this. How could a simple online interaction, something most of us would brush off as inconsequential, escalate into a life-altering crime? Was there something more that could have been done to address the underlying anger and frustration that led Gabriel and Kimahri down such a dark path? Could early intervention, more open communication, or better emotional education have steered these young men away from such violence? This case raises important questions about the role of social media in modern conflicts. Social media is a platform that often magnifies trivial disagreements, feeding into egos and fostering an environment where insults and challenges escalate with frightening speed. The boundaries between online interactions and real-life consequences have become increasingly thin, especially for teenagers who may not yet have the emotional maturity to cope with the harsh realities of online interactions. How can we, as a society, help young people navigate this digital age with the tools they need to communicate effectively and resolve conflicts without resorting to violence? Ultimately, the death of Danika Troy reminds us of the urgent need to address youth violence, emotional health, and the pressures young people face today. It serves as a warning about the potential dangers of unchecked anger, social media conflict, and the importance of fostering empathy, understanding, and emotional resilience in the younger generation. What happened to Danika could happen to anyone. An argument, a few words, and an escalating sense of humiliation leading to a tragic, irreversible consequence. As we reflect on the broader implications of this case, we are reminded of the power of words, the fragility of life, and the devastating impact of violence. Danika's life was stolen, but her memory should serve as a catalyst for change. It is a call to action for communities, families, and schools to do more to understand the root causes of violence and aggression in today's youth, and to take steps to ensure that such a senseless tragedy is never repeated. May we honor Danika's memory by striving for a world where young people are equipped with the tools to deal with conflict in a healthy, nonviolent way, where the stresses of modern life, amplified by the digital world, do not spiral out of control, but instead lead to understanding and growth. Let Danika's story be a lesson to us all about the importance of compassion, communication, and the fragile nature of life.